This week on Dialogue, the quarterly report, big questions for America's schools. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. And once each quarter, we take a look at the latest issue of the Wilson Center's flagship publication, the Wilson Quarterly, with the help of its editor, Steve Lagerfeld. Steve, welcome back.
John, great to be here again.
We are also joined today by two contributors to the current issue. Peter Cookson is a sociologist and educational consultant. He's the author of several books, including School Choice, The Struggle for the Soul of American Education. Thomas Toch is a writer and author. His most recent book is titled High Schools on a Human Scale, How Small Schools Can Transform American Education. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to show our viewers the new cover of the next issue of Wilson Quarterly, and you can see this notion of four big questions. We'll be talking about at least two of those and maybe touching on two of the others during the discussion. And Steve, tell us how you decided upon education as the focus for the cluster of this issue.
Oh, John, we were overdue, number one. I was just mentioning to the other panelists that it's just been a long time since we've visited this subject. It's fall. The time is right. But there's a lot of attention focused, especially this year, on this subject because of a lot of different things, but especially the No Child Left Behind legislation, which is overdue for reauthorization, and the president just made some announcement about giving schools more leeway in meeting some of the goals under that thing. So it's very much in the news, and it's one of our most important national subjects. Always timely. And
you mentioned in your editor's note that it's a much talked about, much studied, much debated issue, and yet there's a sense among us that we're not making the progress that we ought to be, given all the attention that it's received.
I think it's more than a sense.
I'm trying to be open-ended in my questions. I'm not assuming anything.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the data show that over the decades since, say, the A Nation at Risk report first 1983 sounded the alarm, a rising tide of mediocrity. And of course, we've had continuous reform efforts in American education, but this is sort of the modern era. And during that time, we've made, and the numbers show it, very little progress. We know a lot more, or we think we do. My idea here was that we maybe know more. We're sort of focusing on, a few key questions. Obviously, there are more than four, but.
Peter and Tom, I want to spend some time talking generally about education and education reform movements before we dive into some of the specifics of your pieces. And this dominant narrative of struggling American schools, react to that. Is that something that you think is an accurate frame through which to view this discussion?
Yeah, I'll let Tom jump on this too in a minute. But yes, absolutely. We have had, since Steve mentioned, since 1983 and even before then, a whole series of reform waves, you might say, and right now the charter schools are sort of in the spotlight, but there's been a whole set of reform waves. And basically, if you look at the data, we really haven't made the progress that a lot of these reforms sort of promised that they would do. That's just even the measurement in terms of tests. But I think even more importantly, I don't think we have a central metaphor for public education today that we can have consensus around. What do they stand for? What should they be doing? What do they represent in American life? And I think that that's become very fragmented, and I think that also explains why it feels a little bit like it's sort of spinning out of control or has sort of been broken up and fragmented. So in the meantime, the kids that go to these schools, and some of them go to good schools and some of them go to really not very good schools, and it's kind of a moral scandal, a national scandal about the kids, at least in the bottom 40% of the schools, I would say.
Tom, your reaction to this basic framing, would you challenge it or support it?
Well, certainly we're not doing the job today for all students that we would hope to do, but if you look at the historical sweep of American education, we have continually done better by more students, and certainly it would be inaccurate to suggest that we are today simply in need of going back to a time when things were much better, things were rosier in public education. Even in as late as 1950, only half of our white students and only a quarter of our African American students were in school long enough to get high school diplomas. So the challenge for the system is to continue to improve, to reach higher standards with more students, especially today in the context of the shift from an industrial to a knowledge-based economy and growing international competition.
Your analysis reminds me of a Billy Joel lyric, the good old days weren't always good and tomorrow's not as bad as it seems. So I wonder, is there, when we're talking about education either improving or declining, is there a high point in American education history that you could identify where things were hitting on more cylinders than they are today? Or is it what Tom says, it's improving, but it's still not where we want it to be?
Well, I would just follow up. I mean, I would argue that we've never had an ideal sort of situation in American education because we have always not done well enough by many students, and so we are slowly improving. Certainly the conditions in our urban centers have conspired in the last 2 or 3 decades, 3 or 4 decades, to create intense pockets of poverty, which have made the work of public educators far more difficult. But we have never really done the job that we hope to do because, in effect, the bar keeps moving.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
No, that's a very good response. I would just add this as a footnote, that you can't look at schools in an isolated way. The economy has changed dramatically. So if you were a high school graduate in 1950, you could probably get a job working and make a decent living and all of the things related to that. Those jobs are essentially gone now. So part of it is this incredible mismatch between, there are 56 million kids that go to public schools. So public school education in the economy, which, as Tom points out, is it's a knowledge economy, more or less. It's a service economy. So in that sense, I think the schools have fallen in some places back, actually, in the sense that they don't relate well to the economy.
So speaking of the economy, let's focus a bit on the piece you wrote, the title of which is $600 billion enough? Right. Speaking of the economy, a period of austerity that we're living through. One of the things you mentioned in your piece is that there are these converging storms that you identify. Could you tell us what those are?
Well, I think there are converging storms. One is that there's this, there's going to be less money to spend over time, at least in the foreseeable future. And school boards, and Tom will talk about, and others are really reticent. States don't have the money. The federal government eventually will stop probably spending as much money in public education. There's kind of a taxpayer's revolt. So there's that. The other piece of it is that, from my perspective, that many of the schools use outdated curriculum, they use outdated pedagogical techniques, and I think that a lot of bored kids. There was an Indiana study that was done in 2010, which looked at high school students around the country and their level of engagement, and I mean the results were incredible. Only 2% that said they were fully engaged all the time, or 1 out of every 3 kids said they had one teacher they liked. So boredom is a huge factor, and that's because there's this kind of mismatch between the 19th century schools and the 21st century. The kids are sort of postmodern, if you think of that way.
Why is that? Why are schools in this regard seemingly immune from the bigger societal forces? I mean, all of us live very differently in our private lives now. Electronic devices and things like that have changed the way we look for information or find our way from point A to point B. Why are schools seemingly insulated from that?
Well, I'm sure Tom will want to weigh on this, so I'll make it brief.
We get back to school boards. So maybe that's where this is.
So I'll make it brief. I think, first of all, I don't think we want to exaggerate it because there's a lot of innovation and forward-thinking teachers and people. I don't want to say this, that all are this way.
But a lot of people say what you said, that schools are operating on an old model.
But the chunk of it really is still 19th century, at least from my perspective. I think there are 2 reasons for that. One is that schools are conserving institutions. So parents tend to send their kid, and they kind of feel comfortable if it's sort of like when they went to school. So it takes a dynamic leader, really, to help them see
it's good enough for me, it's good enough for my kid, huh?
Secondly, the cultures of schools are generally inwardly looking. That doesn't mean that they don't understand the world's going on, but you have 600 kids in a building. They arrive at 8:30. It's all kind of crowd management issues, and so teachers and educators, same is true in colleges actually, they tend to look inward. And as they look inward, I think even though in their minds they might say, well, there's a lot of great new things that we could be doing, in their daily practices, there just isn't time for it, or there isn't the initiative for it. And the other piece of it is that schools do have serious management issues on a day-to-day basis. I mean, that in the sense that organizing, there are rules. There are these things that have to be in schools, otherwise they would fragment very quickly. So that kind of all conspires, I think, to keep many schools sort of in place rather than looking forward.
Tom, Peter was prompting you on this notion of why schools are somewhat insulated. What do you think is the problem?
Well, I agree with them. Excuse me. They are naturally conservative institutions. They tend to do things today the way they did them yesterday and the day before. It is also very difficult to infuse change in teaching and learning, in instruction, because you're trying to change behavior, which is a very difficult thing, whether it's in education or any other endeavor. And when you have such a decentralized system as our public education system, with over 50 million students, 100,000 schools, et cetera, 50 states, the federal government layered on top, it becomes very difficult to change anything, much less the core work in the classroom, which is a behavioral activity.
You know, I had a thought in listening to both of you that, and I don't know if you had an association like this, Steve, when you were putting the piece together, but in trying to figure what other community institution you compare a school to, now I'm thinking churches in your description, sort of a traditional model of more ties to the past versus, say, hospitals, where we all want the latest MRI machine or whatever it might be that's available. Is that the cultural barrier that we're talking about here?
Well, it's also tied to the fact that teachers typically do the same kind of work today that they have in the past, and it's very hard to change those configurations, which goes to Peter's point in his piece about the cost. It's very hard to make the process more efficient from an economic sense, because today teachers are doing very much the same work. It takes roughly the same amount of teacher work to produce an educated student as it did in the past, and yet we're having to pay teachers more and more just to keep them competitive with other fields. So that public education and education generally, because it's true in private higher education and private schooling at elementary and secondary level, is becoming increasingly inefficient from the perspective of cost effectiveness.
Yeah, the analogy that Peter suggested earlier also strikes me as sort of an interesting combination. You talk about the 19th century sort of origins or model here, and it's really a lot like a factory, actually, that has continued to produce 1955 Chevys or whatever, and you make little marginal adjustments, and but it's a very hard culture, process, procedure to change. At the same time, it has the characteristics of the very most modern parts of our economy, like the healthcare sector, where you have this problem. You have very personal kind of service. Teachers deliver these sorts of things, hard to get, make them more productive. It's hard to do all these things. So in a way, you sort of have the worst of both worlds in a strange way.
Yeah, I think that's all true. There's probably another piece to this that we shouldn't really overlook, which is that good teachers are innovators in their classroom. They're not going to write a book about it. Maybe the principal hardly even knows about it. The parents would know about it. So innovation at that level, at the kind of grassroots level, is actually a lot more common than we think. If you visit a lot of schools, there's some teachers doing great things under very difficult circumstances. And when you think about it,
are they
maybe
doing it under the
model.
radar? Because often it's almost in opposition to the mandated
When I was a first-year teacher in Massachusetts back in the day, we were teaching a course called Mana Course of Study, which you probably remember, and it was Jerome Bruner, and it was very over the edge. It was all sort of anthropology for fifth graders, and you were supposed to fix up your classroom, and we did, and the kids painted all over the walls, and it was great. for someone like me, it was great. Well, it was my first year teaching, and the other teachers in the building, this is rural Massachusetts in the early 1970s, you know, they were all looking in. And I think they must have gone down and reported me to the
What's
principal.
this guy up to?
So about 2 or 3 days later, the principal, which is a nice old school guy but had a heart of gold, comes down and he kind of opens the door to my classroom. He's probably never seen anything like that, and he goes, well, okay. I mean, you know, he was going to let us see what happened with this. It looked like it might be good for kids. And I think there are a lot more people in education like that than they're given credit for. When you're writing at this sort of large-scale policy level, it all sounds sort of cold, and why aren't they doing more? But so many teachers pour their heart out with kids every day. So
I'm not a specialist in this, but as we talked about the subject, I was going to ask you guys exactly that question. My rare exposures to the classroom, they're very unlike the classrooms I was in as a kid.
Right.
And there's a lot of different things going on. It's very heartening what I've seen, but
yeah,
it's hard to understand.
It's largely invisible. That's part of the problem. I think you make a good point there. It's hard for people on the outside to get into schools to see the change, and it's also hard to write about. It's to bring alive in a piece of journalism, for example. Or even on television, you know.
The way most of us hear about it is from our kids who are in school, who come back and tell us about a wonderful teacher and some really interesting things that are happening. And that's all episodic. You don't really quantify that in a meaningful way. We should mention the name of your piece is Who Rules? And we've been dancing around this notion of who is in charge and who is making the decisions, who is leading the reform movements. You identify a central conflict for authority. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, well, as the nation has raised the bar for the public school system, has expected more of the public schools, it has become increasingly difficult to rely on the most local leaders, that is, local school boards, to deliver on these new expectations. So we have, over the last 30 years, slowly but steadily, moved towards a more centralized set of expectations for our schools. And that is in sharp contrast to and in deep tension with our longstanding commitment in this country to local control, going back to Massachusetts, 400 years ago, when, before it was even a state, the leaders of the colonies demanded that every community create a school and then create a committee to run the school, which was the origin of local school boards. So you hear it today very often, and even at the political level, presidential campaign level, where some folks, usually more conservatives, tend to be on the Republican side, argue for local control, a return to local control, whereas many school reformers believe that we need to have at least expressed through national curriculum and maybe standards and even some testing, the sort of more generalized, more national priorities for education. So
which gained momentum under a Republican president.
Yes.
W. Bush.
Yeah, and so in some ways this is, even though I suggested that it might be a partisan issue, in some ways it's post-partisan because you get Republicans, conservatives, as well as liberals and moderates supporting the centralization sort of movement, and then you get both the left and the right opposing it. So it's very complicated. It goes to the sort of heart of our notion of federalism, local autonomy, individualism.
Those who push for this return to local control, do they acknowledge the fact that back in 1983, when we had this seminal report, that it talked about the problem was not enough national or state standards? Do they address that, or is it all romanticizing the past?
No, it's much of the latter. People tend not to acknowledge that local school systems have not done the job that we want them to do.
There's an interesting data point that keeps coming up in this discussion, that people often think that their local school's pretty good, but other schools are really terrible.
Yeah, that's how we think about members of Congress, too. We like our guy. We throw the other bums out.
So I agree with Tom. Of course, I think we do need a national vision for public education. But we do have this tradition that started with Jefferson, that schools would be local control, that there would be a lot of little public school districts. I think the reason that there are many reasons, but one of the reasons why it's difficult to overcome this seemingly anachronistic way of organizing public schools is that it's the center of the community in many ways. So for instance, we emphasize so much sports in schools, so the whole sporting thing becomes a really big deal for the local community. Very often teachers come from that community. Sometimes the principal comes from that community. So there's a sense that they own it. They have a sense of ownership. I'm not saying this is good, but I think that's what's really going on. And therefore, when somebody, I've been to many school board meetings, when somebody from the outside comes in and they give a little presentation about something that ought to be done, it could even be something fairly small and reasonable, there's a kind of inbuilt, well, we don't really do it this way here. And sometimes they do it and sometimes they don't. But really, that's not what's going on. And where you can see this really carefully is school closure movements. There's a lot of good economic reasons in many districts to close schools. It is a battle, and it has cost more than one superintendent his or her job. Because even though the school is dysfunctional, it's under-enrolled, closing that school, it's like saying, we don't care about your community. And that's battle.
So is parent involvement or community involvement, is it a double-edged sword? Everyone gives lip service to it. We need more of that. On the other hand, is it this meddling by non-professional educators that creates a lot of the problem?
Well, I'll tell Tom.
I mean, I think of a school board. Would you have a political group run a hospital, for example?
You wouldn't want that, would you?
Not me.
I don't think we'll do the hard thing this year. Well, I think if you're a teacher or you're a principal, you know what a really good principal can do? A good principal can run a school so the parents all feel that they're part of the school, but in actuality, the teachers aren't interfered with very much by the parents. That's the kind of political skill. So parents are invited in. There's research about parent involvement. But in the terms of running the school and the school board, you see, that's their frame of reference as a parent. So the larger issues of curriculum development, of what this testing might mean, they don't know what testing means, really. I mean, why would they? They don't have a background in statistics. It becomes very contentious, very contentious.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was just going to say, in all of these things, though, there are different levels at which these things are true. Parent involvement in their individual child's education is
very important.
Is really
number one variable.
But isn't a lot of that preparing the child to come to school?
Right.
Rather than meddling with what actually happens within the school.
Yeah, I don't know that I would call it meddling.
I know.
Making sure they do their homework, helping them find resources.
Well, you were going to go somewhere else with that, your question.
I was just saying that with all these things, and as I was putting this together and learning about the subject netting, I was interested in the multiple levels at which each of these questions really can be answered. Yeah. And so when you talk about parent involvement and local control, all of these things there's several different meanings to that, and some of them are sort of bad or at least troublesome, and some of them are really good. Yeah. And certainly when you talk about like the need for national testing and a national curriculum or whatever, the other part of that usually is spoken is that at the classroom level or at the school level, administrators and teachers should be left to kind of figure out how to get this done themselves. And so we're talking about more nationalization, more centralization, but in a way more decentralization at the same time.
I agree.
Right. You have to improve schools from the inside out as well as from the outside in, which is what a number of the countries that we aspire to do as well as educationally on international assessments do. I mean, they have a common national vision around.
Is that the top lesson we can take away from other countries?
Well, I mean, we're sending a lot of emissaries to Finland and Singapore and other places to find out what they're doing, and they have a common vision, a national vision of education. But as Steve suggests, they increasingly are comfortable with giving local educators autonomy in meeting those national expectations.
And Peter, a quick thought. We're short on time, unfortunately, but something we haven't addressed explicitly is the answer to your question about is it enough money? We've had a bit of a schizophrenic discussion of money as far as sometimes there's more needed, other times we're spending too much. What is the connection between school performance and money spent?
Well, what I argue in the article is that that's a lot of money. And I don't think we can expect to see a lot more money in the, in the near future, in the intermediate future. I think it's that we're not spending the money the most effective way that we can. And so I make an argument, it's not a total answer or anything, but at least a good partial answer is to think about the ways that we can take both what's needed in terms of individualized instruction, because that is really the key to learning. That's the key variable. And the second thing is how can we use technology to enhance that? Not technology as some big apparatus thing, but how can we use that so kids do get this customized, individualized experience. Over time, I think that would actually save money, and I think it would actually improve learning. I've seen it myself, and I think if you think about it logically, we don't have time to go through it here. There's a good argument to be made for that. And that's pretty much what I came out of.
What are you aware of that's in the pipeline as far as ideas or reform movements that are most promising to you? Whether they're individual schools or states or wherever they're occurring?
Well, that's a great question. I think on the one hand, the increasing interest in personalizing education, as Peter suggests, is very important. How we do that without letting the sort of sense of school, the sense of community drop away will be a really important question.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's that. And then I think we could, if we could ever mobilize ourselves around this, we could really do some things in curriculum development now. It doesn't sound like the most interesting topic in the world, but I think it is a core topic where kids could really be learning about the world. They learn differently, what they need to know about the world. If we could get some energy behind something like that in the next decade, I think the schools would look a lot different. We'd have to prepare the teachers differently as well, but I think the schools would look a lot different.
Thanks. A quick final thought, about 30 seconds left. What else is in the issue for people who are interested in the quarterly beyond what we've talked about today?
We have a fascinating piece on post-traumatic stress disorder, believe it or not, a very complicated issue. We have a wonderful interview with Michael Scammell, the biographer of Solzhenitsyn and Kessler, the great writers, the great anti-totalitarian writers. And we have a very good piece by Martin Walker on the revolution in world trade. I won't even try and explain what the revolution is.
Martin, always interesting. Thank you, gentlemen. Speaking of interesting,
Thank you. It's great being here.
Terrific discussion. Thanks. Thanks for watching. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Please join us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.